this student who writes so prolifically and full of all sorts of errors and sentimentality, all kinds of things. It's impossible to criticize him. But you say she has the real thing, somehow. And I know she gave me a gift. She graduated from college, and she gave me a little gift when she graduated, a little paperback book. And she wrote an inscription in it that was very good. It was the best thing she's ever written, and it was very short. It was one sentence. It was one sentence. Yes, she had to write it on a page of this, but it was beautiful, really. It was very, very well done.
Sure.
She's learned.
See, all that overflow, finally,
yeah.
Something was out of it. Well, we would say even of Edmund Spenser that he wrote so much.
Yeah.
That some of it must be good.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
I'm not so sure I've ever found it, but the anthologists probably can come up with some gems.
Yeah,
it's true. The habit of verse. This is, I suppose we've said this over and over again. We really miss our old colleague Frank Millick, because one of the things he used to do, he'd listen to you and I talk like this, and he'd sit there and he'd say to the students, "Now that's important," he'd say. "Now that's important. You listen to that." And it is, I mean, we're talking about
something. Or he'd say, "You think you understand that, don't you?" You don't understand it at all.
Think about it again. It is important. I know we're all interested in the kingdom, heaven, but we're not going to get there without verse.
Well, you have to sing.
Without those accidents.
You're going to have to sing in heaven. And John Donne has a poem where he says he's dying. He's on his deathbed, and he says, what I'm doing is, and he writes a poem about on his deathbed, about his dying, and he says he's tuning the instrument here at the door. He's practicing for the next life. That's what he's doing by his verse, and that's just what Socrates did in his death cell. He did the same thing. He versified Aesop's fables in his death cell. That was part of his preparation for death.
Boethius
was doing the same thing. That's right. It's happened again and again and again. St. Thomas More did the same thing in his prison cell. So you can't
get to heaven without verse.
No, you're going to have to. And as again, Donne says, well, if you don't experience joy here, you're not going to experience it in heaven. You have to experience it here. And that joy, there's a joy in verse. There's a great pleasure in it.
There is a joy in verse, and I'll put it backwards. Logicians have a word for doing this. I forget what it is, where you put things backwards. And sometimes they're equally true, and sometimes they're not. This is one of the cases where they are. What did you say?
There's
joy in verse.
Yeah.
There is no joy without verse. That is, all joy is verse. I think convertible, those are convertible terms. That's the word I was thinking of. They're convertible terms. That is, we know philosophically, if we analyze joy, that it derives from order. It derives from the perception of order and the recognition of order. And that's what verse is. Verse is an exquisite ordering of language. It's a recognition of order. Music of any kind. Dancing, music, that is the metric, that is the recognition of the order of things. In Latin, in the Latin language, the word for prose is simply loose talk. That is, you just let it go. It's actually abnormal. It's something. When you're riding a horse, you don't just let him go. You have to have a bridle. If you're going to ride a horse, you have to have that bridle and bit. Now, you don't have to hold him in. You can ride with a light rein, but you have to have the bridle. And loose speech, just letting language go, is a failure in recognition of order, and therefore a failure in joy.
In English, the word prose, which comes from Latin, just as the word verse comes from Latin, the word prose does come also from verse, only it means something that doesn't turn. Ultimately, etymologists trace it back to the idea, they say it's proversus, meaning something that doesn't have a turn, that goes straight on. That prose goes straight on, and verse has a kind of turn. It has a turn in it. Perhaps it's a kind of cliche. People would talk about a well-turned verse. The word "turn" means a lot of different things, but prose doesn't have those turnings. I mean, you can have very good prose, and you can have very, very bad prose. We have mostly the latter kind right now. But the thing that verse has is this turning in it, and it has a kind of it has a regularity and an order in it, but it doesn't go straight on. It isn't like a turnpike. It isn't. It's like a country road that turns. It's going somewhere, and it's still a road. It's an actual road, but it doesn't go straight on the way prose does, and therefore it does have in it that delight of the country road that has many turnings in it, but still always remains the road.
See, it's not just wild.
No, it's not just wandering around in the wilderness.
No,
in
fact, even in James Fenimore novels, like Deerslayer and Pathfinder, and those books where he deals with the wild, savage Indians. Well, Pathfinder is the very name given to. That's one of Matty Bumppo's several names, isn't it?
Right.
One of the heroes. The Indians give him several names over his lifetime. At one time, he's called Pathfinder. Well, there are paths in the forests. Now, those paths originally were made by animals, I suppose, by deer. But the wise woodsman knows where those paths are. And they wind and turn and so on, but he knows where they are. In the song, it even speaks about following the paths of the sea.
I was just going to say that. Yeah.
And there are paths in the sea,
paths
and ships follow them. That is, certainly the sailing ships did. That is, they were the trade winds and the currents. That they followed in order to speed on their way. And I think even for that matter, even the steamships still have to recognize the existence of these.
They talk about the paths of the fish, the roads of the fish. That the fish swim along certain paths in the sea too. They don't just swim at random. In other words, there's no, that idea of randomness is
that's chaos.
Yeah,
and there's no joy in chaos.
No.
Absolutely none. That's the Lucretian hatred. That is, when Lucretius contemplates the universe, he sees random atoms and he hates. I mean, it really, there's no joy in it. But there's tremendous joy in order. The recognition of order is the reason for our joy. I was trying to think of that Latin word. It's called oratio soluta, dissolved speech, released speech. Cicero will speak about poetry, and then he'll talk about, well, that was written in oratio soluta, meaning you just let it go. The word solution has to do with untying the knot, kind of dissolving it or letting it go. Whereas verse has to do with order.
It suggests, you see, that etymology suggests, as it does with just prose and verse, that the fundamental thing is verse,
right.
And that prose is a kind of falling away or a negation of that.
Which we have to do. I mean,
everyone has to speak prose.
but it's a falling down.
Yeah, it's a down. Yeah, it goes downward. It's not as ordered as verse is. We think of it the other way. See, everyone thinks, well, verse is unusual and exceptional, and it's not the normal thing. But the fact is that when language becomes really itself, when it lives up to itself, then it becomes verse. prose is not the standard, I guess you would say. The standard of language is verse. I'm sitting here just gazing out a window, and the wind is blowing, and I'm just looking at the tree with the leaves blowing on the tree. And a lot of people would say, well, you see, there's an example of some kind of randomness. You see all those leaves moving in different ways as the wind blows, and who knows, the velocity of that wind, and it lets up and it blows harder and so forth. But that isn't the case at all, really. You can see instantly that all of those leaves blowing in various ways are all still following some order. There's an order there, and within that order there is a great deal of variety, as there always is within real order. But it's the delight of just watching the leaves blow on a limb is an example of this kind of versification.
There's a rhythm.
There's a rhythm, and there's a motion, and it isn't random.
It isn't chaos at all.
No, not at all. It's only blowing because the wind. They're only moving because the wind is blowing, you say, and they're blowing in a certain characteristic way. And if you look at the leaves on that tree, they're blowing differently from the leaves on another tree. But they're blowing according to a certain definite character.
People with good eyes, and pathfinders, can tell you what tree it is.
Yeah, by the way
by the way the leaves move. I mean, that's one of the ways they'll.
The way the boughs bend.
At a distance. I remember it was a man out here. It was last fall, and we were talking about. There's a great big pasture kind of next to us, and he had a mowing machine, and he was going to mow it down. And I said, "Well, would you save some of those larger trees that are growing up? That is, at one time had been completely plowed off, but wild trees are starting to come back." And he said, "Oh yeah," he said, "Sure." He said, "I can see you got some good ones over there." And he started to name all these trees. I couldn't even see them, from a distance. And I said, "How do you know which tree is which?" And he looked at me in amazement. and in the Boy Scout manual it says, in order to determine whether it's an oak or whether it's an elm or whether it's this, if you examine the bark and you examine the leaves. This guy was looking at them from a half a mile away, and he said, "Well, you just."
And the kind of shape.
The way the leaves blow in the wind and so on. I mean, and he didn't even know. I don't think he had ever analyzed.
Well, if he could hear them, he could probably tell from the sounds that they made when they. Right. I can tell a cottonwood from an elm because of the kind of rattling sound.
Yeah. I mean, that's true of everything in nature. That is, everything in nature is metrical. There is an order there. There is a rhythm there. Well, one of the most famous examples is the leaf itself. That is, its vein, and the veins. There's a little branch there, and it's balanced in a way, but always slightly off. There's always a variation.
It's not mechanical.
Not mechanical.
There's a symmetry and a regularity, but it's not a mechanical regularity, not a mechanical symmetry.
Any more than there is in, as we were saying, the curfew tolls the knell of parting day, the lowing bird flying slowly over the lea. And the word wind is a variation on that basic structure that's there. Well, we've spent almost the whole of our day here talking, but one of the things we've said before, and we'll say it again and again, is we're not in a hurry. I was talking to a young fellow the other day whose little boy is reading, and he said, it's incredible. He reads those books so fast. And he said to the little child, he said, "How long does it take you to read that book about? Well, you're reading those things in less than a day." And the little boy looked up and said, "Oh no, it takes me 3 days." And I must say, I did have to interrupt and say, "Well, for goodness sakes, don't! what are you in a hurry about? I mean, it's not a virtue to read them in a day." Of course, the little boy thought he was in a hurry. He wanted to get to the plot. He wanted to get to the end of the story. He was in a hurry. But that idea of doing everything fast, we're certainly not in a hurry at this moment with verse. Take a look at the English anthology and stop and memorize some poems until you get the feeling. Well, you were onto sounds, and sounds led us into the mush. That is the
cess.
Cess. where people get so self-conscious about things like alliteration. I mean, plods is the plowman homeward plods, and so
His
you
weary
get this
way.
weary way, and so people say, "Oh, that's great," and then
They try to imitate it.
then you get I don't know what the poor police pull their pullovers over their poor heads or something, and you say, "Oh, no, alliteration is good, but not too much of it is not good," and yet it's all over the place in this standard English poem. I would say that of all of this may be the standard English poem. If you had to pick out one for the whole thing, this would be it. I think it would. I can't think of any other poem that does everything that a poem does in a reasonably short space. That doesn't mean it's the greatest poem in the English language, but it means it's a very good one.
No, it may not even be a great poem at all.
Yeah.
It's been challenged. Some people have said it's just not quite a great poem. It's a remarkable poem. It is, and it is the standard poem, but that's not the same thing. You can't really quite have what we call a standard poem.
Boy, it's hard to measure this because it's the measure. I mean, when someone says, "Is the elegy written in the country churchyard a great poem?" you have to say, well, that's the one by which we measure all the others. Do we say how more or less does it conform to that? I don't know. Gee, as I look at some of those lines, or wait to ecstasy the living wire. Well, I don't know. I think it's great. I think it's great. I think maybe it's got so popular.
Well, that's one of its problems is how many times people who've never read this poem, never heard of this poem, talk about someone plodding their weary way. Weary way is a cliche, and people use it with no consciousness at all that they're imitating or repeating Gray, but that's true of 100 lines in this poem that people repeat. It's sunk down into language. The English language has become saturated with these phrases, and the result is that they have become, we say, hackneyed. When they're kind of taken out of context and detached from the poem, then they get tired of hearing them.
For example, full many a gem of purest ray serene, the dark unfathomed caves of ocean bear. Full many a flower is born to blush unseen and waste its sweetness on the desert air. Millions of people know those lines and have no idea that they're part of a great poem.
Well, and the sentiment too. Not only the words, but the sentiment itself is conventional. You say, well, that's a very ordinary idea.
Gee, it's so well said, though.
Yeah, you're on the verge of quoting Pope.
Yes.
What often is thought, but ne'er so well expressed. That's a great line too. That's another line that's quoted over and over and over, endlessly. What oft was thought, but ne'er so well expressed. Well, that's true. There's something about poetry in that, because after all, the poet is not striving to have original ideas at all. We do have the idea that a poet is supposed to be creative, have new ideas, and say things that nobody has ever thought of before. Ridiculous things, often absurd things, nonsensical.
Anything
things,
just to be new.
Just to be new. And you say, no. The great body. If you read through this anthology, and if you read through Chaucer is full of commonplaces. And I always point these out in Shakespeare. Shakespeare, who is, held to be the greatest English poet. I'm constantly saying to students, that is reduce that idea to prose, and you'll discover that as an idea, it's just the most common idea. Roses are red, violets blue. It's nothing. But of course, when he expresses it, then he does get to something that is at the heart of things. And it ceases to be simply a truism. But it still he has not. When you try to reduce it, you say, well, he really has not said anything original at all. Shakespeare, Chaucer is particularly that way in Chaucer, but Shakespeare is the same way. Shakespeare, I don't think you can find an original idea in Shakespeare from beginning to end. I haven't read every word of Shakespeare, but I must say, the more you read him, you say, well, they're often proverbs that he has, common proverbs. Someone has a whole book of the proverbial sayings of Shakespeare. It's a great big volume just listing all of the phrases and sentences in Shakespeare that come from proverbs, and they undoubtedly do. And the same is true of Chaucer. And Gray, of course, he is a kind of proverbialist himself. I know once when I taught the book of Proverbs in a class, I had never taught it before. It was in a literature class of some sort, and everybody, the students, these were all honor students, and they kind of laughed at those proverbs. They said, oh, those are such commonplaces. I said, well, yeah, but
commonplaces.
Yeah, what's wrong with
commonplace book?
Yeah, that's what the proverb is. You see, that is common wisdom. That they were looking for originality. They're attuned to modern poetry where people are straining to say original and often controversial things.
Yeah, if you turn to the back of this anthology, for example, and you do get into the very modern stuff, I wonder, does it change, or even do these guys finally, if you get into this thing at all, you tend to get back into the anthology. Now that's a tautology. If you're in the anthology, you're in the anthology. That's all I'm saying. But even, for example, Dylan Thomas, who is one of the most modernistic of modern poets. Dylan Thomas has written some poems which are so modern as to be totally unintelligible. He wrote a poem called The Ballad of the Long-Legged Bait. And I would submit to you that if you read that poem, you will not understand it from beginning to end. And I can remember listening to a learned paper by a graduate student at a seminar who explained that it was an epithalamium. It was a poem on his own marriage. Well, I thought, boy, if you could figure that out, you could figure out anything. But Dylan Thomas wrote a few poems out of a collected works. And those few poems are in this anthology. And even though it's true they're modern in their expression, that is, there is a lot of jazzy language, I think, a lot of highly ornate, sophisticated language. Well, he's read John Donne. He's imitating that Baroque style. There was a great revival of the Baroque.
Yeah, well, and he overdoes, he exaggerates the sound. The sound, there's always a tension between sound and sense. That's a commonplace. And you see, if you go to Alexander Pope, you see, well, the sense tends to dominate. It tends to dominate in Gray's poem. If you go to Dylan Thomas, then the sound begins to dominate. And at times you think, well, this is just sound. The sense, or Edmund Spencer for that matter. These things fluctuate back and forth in history, and so Dylan Thomas is very conscious of the sound that it makes. And if you said to him, well, that doesn't make much sense, Dylan, he'd say, oh, who cares? It's beautiful.
No.
It sounds marvelous.
And he's right.
It is. It does sound marvelous.
But for example, the first of his poems in here is one called, famous one of his called The Force That Through the Green Fuse Drives the Flower. And that's the first line. That's why it's called.
It's right out of Chaucer.
Why, it is. It is. The force, and look at even the rhythm. The force that through the green fuse drives the flower, drives my green age that blasts the root of trees. Now it's varied quite heavily, but is there. Now he breaks it in the next line. He has a whole line that goes, is my destroyer, and that's the whole line. So he deliberately messes it up, but nonetheless, he can't wholly get away from the anthology. It's got him.
Yeah.
Now, if we go over the meaning of that, as you said, it's right, like Chaucer. The force that through the green fuse. Now, you do have to stop and say, boy, that's an image. That's a metaphor, far-fetched metaphor. What he's saying is the stem of the flower is like the fuse on a firecracker or on a bomb. That is, the flower is an explosion of the root, and it goes through the fuse there. Well, that's pretty good. It's a little exaggerated. And Gray, the author of the elegy, would reject it. He would say, well, that's excessive. He would say, not that he wasn't capable of thinking of it, but he would think, you could imagine in one of Shakespeare's plays, one of those literary characters, like Polonius, saying, oh, that's vile.
That's vile phrase.
That's a vile phrase. That's excessive. He would say, Dylan Thomas is being silly here. And I think we would all agree that it's excessive. But nonetheless, it's real. I mean, he's not writing nonsense. That is, he has conceived of something there. The force that through the green fuse drives the flower drives my green age. Well, that's pretty good.
Very good. That's my green age. That's very good.
Very good.
That's very good.
That's, of course, out of Marvel.
Yeah.
But you have to say that Dylan Thomas is a sophisticated poet. He's read the anthology. He knows, well, he studied a lot of his predecessors, and it's a late decadent kind of verse, but it's very good.
Listen to those F's. The force that through the green fuse drives the flower. Oh, that's good. That's very good. It's a little Baroque, but it's still that's what is called alliteration, folks, right, and he knows it as well as Edmund Spencer knew it.
I mean, I was just glancing through here, and they even had a poem in here of Edith Sitwell, who was something of a witch, and now I've lost it. But I was just looking at it, and it was all about spring. I mean, she couldn't help herself either, and she was a nut.
Deliberate, eccentric.
Eccentric, but as she wrote nonsense, really what amounts to nonsense verse sometimes, but
it's often quite amusing. She has a sense of humor.
Very witty in a way. But she had this poem called Spring. When spring begins, the maids in flocks walk in soft fields, and their sheepskin locks fall shadowless, soft as music, round their jonquil eyelids and reach the ground. That's kind of nice. It's kind of cute, and it rhymes, and it's well. Yeah. I don't know, but what even the most modernistic poets, Edith Sitwell wrote deliberate, crazy stuff under the influence of the Surrealists. She read the French Surrealists, and she said, well, I'm going to do that in English. And she wrote a lot of stuff, which is like the Surrealists. It's kind of funny sometimes. Mm-hmm. It's so absolutely weird. But that didn't get into the anthology. What got into the anthology was in spring, the maids with their locks and their frocks. And we're talking, well, let's go back now to Thomas Gray. We talked about the metric of the poem. We talked about the sound of the poem. We talked about the emotions, the conventional emotions of the poem. And I do think we also have to say the conventional subject matter in poems. That is, all poems are about spring and especially age. That Dylan Thomas, they're talking about my green age. All poems are about the passing of time. Chaucer's full of it. That is spring.
There you are. Start with spring.
It's such a frail thing, the flowers of spring, because we know that they're going to fade, and all that, That is the passage of time, the sadness of beauty, because it passes. I think you could probably list the 10 only subjects that are ever treated by poets who get into the anthology. Now, very sophisticated poets deliberately try to avoid that. So they write odes to cockroaches and things like that, but they don't get into the anthology. I mean, those things amuse somebody for a moment, but in the long run, you're rounded off. Nature wins. I really do believe that nature wins.
Edith Sitwell has a poem about herself as an old woman sitting there waiting for, she says, what does she call it? A renaissance of wonder, or recovery of wonder. An old woman sitting there. I don't know if it's in that anthology or not. Maybe. It's quite a well-known poem.
She's trying to
there she is.
Find her here. She's
old
right.
woman. Makes perfectly good sense. Is it there? It's a.
Is this harvest I, an old woman whose heart is like the sun?
That isn't it.
That's not it.
But there it is again. There it is again.
That has seen too much, looked on too many sorrows, yet is not weary of shining fulfillment and harvest.
That's a pretty standard poem. That's just nothing extraordinary about that at all. I was going to say though that poem about waiting for a recovery of wonder. One of the worst of American kind of beatnik poets took that as the whole substance of the poem that he wrote. That I'm waiting. He says, I'm waiting for a renaissance of wonder. Over and over and over he goes on about it. It's one of his better poems. It's still rather hollow and silly. Oh, what's his name? That really crazy, one of the first beatnik poets. What's his name? The guy, I think he was at Columbia when you were there. What's his name?
Not Ginsberg.
Yeah, Ginsberg.
Allen Ginsberg.
Yeah, Allen Ginsberg. He's terrible.
Well, he's read the anthology.
He read the anthology.
See, he had a Columbia education.
He stole that line right out of Edith Sitwell, and she got it from everybody else.
Oh yeah, you can't. In the long run, even Allen Ginsberg might get into the anthology.
Yeah.
That is, again, he's written a lot.
Yeah.
He spent his whole life being a poet, and he's deliberately tried not to be a poet.
Yeah, he's tried to shock and
he's defied the anthology.
Yeah.
But he might. I don't think he will. But it's possible.
Yeah.
This is our job here, I think, to get to know English verse, and it is a conventional thing. There are Oliver Goldsmith. We memorize some of his poems. You mentioned rural.
The rural setting.
All
the herd that lows.
All poems are written about the country. Virgil thought of that, I guess, more than anybody else.
Oh, yes.
Although it's in the Greeks as well. But country life. Now again, Baudelaire, the French poet, deliberately wrote about cities. Well, T.S. Eliot, imitating Baudelaire, deliberately wrote about cities. Tenements even, and sordid scenes.
Of course, they usually write about how horrible they are.
But again,
so you turn back to the country as a result.
I mean, the wasteland is all about the city and the blight, the urban blight, as they call it. But all poetry, either backwards or forwards, turns out to be about the country. Now that's
has its roots in the country.
Yeah. See, again, the modern poet says, I mean, T.S. Eliot said, and Baudelaire said, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to write about the city.
Yeah, this is the era of the city.
Yeah. So what you say is, well, no, there is such a thing as nature, and you can't do it. If you're going to write a poem, you're going to have to write it about the country. There's no other way to write a poem.
Yeah, well, the city is something that is, it's like prose. The city is something that is imposed on nature. It's not the fundamental thing, it's a secondary thing. You know the cliche, it's a wretched cliche, God made the country, man made the city, God made the country. Well, it's true, that's true. It is a cliche, but it's true. The city has a kind of temporary look about it. You say, well, you just leave that city alone for a year or so. You just evacuate that city for a year and come back and see what's left of it. It'll all be overgrown. The country will just move in, and grow up through the sidewalk. The countryside is going to be there. It's something permanent, and the city is something temporary, and it's very hard to make poetry out of those kinds of ephemeral things. Again, you get the cities of the Bible, the Nineveh. Oh, what poetry there is in Nineveh and Babylon and all those great cities. But why? Well, because they're fallen.
Fallen.
Babylon's fallen. Nineveh is fallen.
And you don't celebrate Babylon.
No.
See, the thing, again, poetry is praise.
Yeah.
It's order and joy and the response. What is praise? What is joy? Well, joy is the response to order. I'm going to make some stipulated definitions here. Of course, you can define them in other ways, but I think this is perfectly true. Joy is a response to order. What is praise? Praise is the voice of joy. That's all it is. That is, you give voice to your joy. So therefore, if you follow the logic of those definitions, praise is giving voice to order. That is, it's expressing order. Now, a city is a disorder. It's something against nature. I was just looking at T.S. Eliot here, and he has
it's the result of the fall.
Unreal city, he calls it.
Unreal city. Yeah, unreal city. It's a result of the fall.
Garden of Eden, not the city of Eden.
No. And the city grew up. Cain made the city, and it was because of the fall. We have to have cities. There's no question about it.
Augustine wrote the city of God.
Well, but that's against the city of the world.
That's against the city of the world.
That's another
city.
Yeah. Jerusalem is a city too, but it's the heavenly city. That is, immediately after the fall, the city then it becomes it's by grace it's given the capacity.
In this anthology, toward the end here, there's T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland is given in its entirety, and line 60 is unreal city. And there's a footnote in this edition, and the editor can't let that alone. I look down at the bottom of the page, and it says here, footnote number 50, and it says, Eliot calls attention at this point to Baudelaire's poem, The Seven Old Men, which begins, swarming city full of dreams, where the spectre in full day walks with the passer-by. Baudelaire describes a visit to the slums through foul yellow fog, where he met in succession 7 old men, evil-eyed, bent, hostile. These 7 hideous monsters had the look of eternal beings. Well, it's a good footnote. It's an informative footnote.
It is, yeah.
And Baudelaire's poem is probably better than Eliot's. Frankly, I don't remember that poem Baudelaire's. I read a lot of them. It makes me want to now go back and read it, But boy, Baudelaire understood that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hell. I mean, that's hell.
Yeah.
It's right out of Dante's Inferno. That's what it is. These 7 hideous men that he meets, eagle-eyed and in the slums and the yellow fog. Today we use the word pollution. That's the favorite commonplace word today. So all poetry is about time, and all poetry is about
the country. And finally, it comes down to the country churchyard. It's all about death.
It's all about death. I see a lily on thy brow, with anguish moist and fever dew, and on thy cheeks a fading rose, fast withereth too. That's John Keats about death. Yes, just as you said the word death, I was
He just opened it random. He just picked opened
really,
it
I was just going through.
You could do that. You could do that.
There you are. I see a lily on thy brow. Well, that's the pale. Again, that's a good image. Again, people say, well, John Keats is a romantic poet, and that's so overdone and sentimental. Well, that's a good image. That is, the lily on the brow is a very good image for that waxy look of somebody who's dying, as a matter of fact. And lilies are, I don't know why I associate them with death. I don't know why.
They always are. They always are. Yeah.
People
funerals. Well, they have a very powerful odor.
Oh, to cover up the stink.
Cover up the smell. That's right.
Oh, geez.
Frank used to point that out all the time. He always used those heavily scented flowers, especially the lily.
Yeah.
But what happens is it becomes associated with death. The smell. It's very sweet. It's almost too sweet. It's so sweet. But the
if
look
you look
of
at a dying person, one of the things that always strikes you, you can tell, it's the color, I think.
Well, and that waxy look
waxy,
too that
yeah.
that lilies have.
Yeah. I see a lily on my brow, with anguish moist in fever dew, D-E-W, drops of dew on the brow, and on thy cheeks a fading rose, fast with earth, too. Oh, gee, the English anthology is the best of all anthologies. Now, maybe we say that because we're English-speaking people, but
Well, no, I
think
was just
so.
going to say,
Sure.
why are these are only English poems. These are not American poems. You won't find any American poems in here at all. These are strictly English, British poems. And why is it? You could not conceivably make up an anthology half that size. Now, England has a longer history, but you couldn't make one up a quarter of the size of this book with poems of the same quality from the American tradition.
Not even.
Not even that.
Well, I was going to say not even French.
No, I know.
I mean,
it's true.
the French make anthologies up all the time, but there's an awful lot of junk in there. There are some good French poets. I mean, Baudelaire, for example, is a marvelous poet. But really, take it all in all, the French gift is not lyric. They have champagne. I mean, the French have gifts.
They have life. They create life.
I'm not knocking the French. They're actually marvelous people. But lyric poetry, no. The English surpass all other nations. When we speak of music, we speak of Germany. There's nobody like Mozart and Beethoven and, God love him, Johann Sebastian Bach. You know, I've spent an awful lot of time hating Bach. I really, because he is so mechanical, it seems to me. But just today, the radio turned on, and he can strike you with a phrase so moving that you say, that's the German soul. It's just music, just absolutely marvelous. So I mean, and Italians have painting which is beyond compare. Nations have their genius, but
and opera.
Opera! Italian opera is just, it's unbelievable. Yeah. But English poetry, English lyric poetry, right?
And a lot of it is, the British character.
Mm-hmm.
There is such a thing as the British character, and a lot of it is conventionality. We'd be talking about conventionality. The British are very conventional.
That's true.
People.
They're eccentric, but conventional. That seems like a contradiction, but it's not.
It's a very funny combination. They want everything to be right and to be proper.
Yeah.
Like T.S. Eliot. What they want, by gosh, it ought to rhyme.
Yeah.
They say it ought to have the right meter, by gosh. It ought to be according to and tradition. Oh my gosh, the British are just so, we say, well, they're just awash in tradition, even now, even despite all the horrors of the modern world that have tried to destroy tradition. The British are still deeply traditional. They're rooted in the past. They love the past.
And they're idiosyncratic, as I use the word eccentric. That is, again, lyric poetry, the English don't have a great epic poetry. It's lyric for them.
No.
Although with Shakespeare, we say they have a great dramatic poetry, but I can submit to you that Shakespeare is really a lyric poet who got onto the stage. That is, he doesn't write, we've said this before, he doesn't write classical tragedy.
Oh, no.
He
Not at all.
doesn't fit Aristotle's rules. The French do. That is, if you Racine and Corneille write, according to the rules, but Shakespeare doesn't. Shakespeare is a lyric genius who put people on the stage, and what they do is they speak poems all the time. I've argued with people about that for years, that Aristotle says that plot is the soul of tragedy, and if you try to defend Shakespeare's plays on the basis of the plot, you're going to lose. Those plots are nuts. They're as balmy as Italian opera, but what lyrics!
If you tried to reduce them, to prose, and you can write a little lamb's tales of Shakespeare and little stories you can read, because they all do come from stories. But then the poetry's gone, the lyric is gone, and you don't have anything at all.
Well, I wonder if does the word anthology? I never looked it up, but does it come from that same root as anthropology does? Does it have to do with that notion of turn? I bet it does.
Tropos, I think it has to have the R in it. See, tropos.
Well, the tropos is the term that I meant. The an.
Yeah, the an. Yeah,
is the back or the up. The up turn.
I think it does.
And I bet an anthology is something that.
Yeah, I've never.
There, instead of tropos, you've got ology, which means, of course, science of, or the study of, or the words.
Yeah, or literally.
Literally, it would mean the words that turn you up, uplifting or upturning. And we spoke about that as the essence of the lyric. As if you wanted to find the lyric, what the lyric does is it metamorphoses.
Well, it's vertical. Again, the word verse is the same. It has the same root as vertical, turning it, which is the upturning.
And if I'm sure that is the ultimate root of anthology, and that's what it must be. That is, the English anthology is that collection of words, logos, which lift you up, that is, which are not the same thing as drama, or the same thing as narrative or epic. Now, of course, there are narratives. Chaucer, to go back to him, and are we almost through?
Yeah, we are.
Next time, we promise, we'll go back to Chaucer. But Chaucer tells stories, and they're marvelous stories, and boy, is he a storyteller. As he's not as great poet like Homer, but there's nobody can tell a story like Chaucer. But he's also an English poet, and the lyric goes on and on. One of the things, do we have a couple of minutes?
Yeah, we do.
A minute.
Yeah, we do.
One of the things I want to perhaps to finish on is to read the last lines of the Canterbury Tales. That is, Chaucer didn't finish the poem, but he did. That is, he wrote an ending to it. He says, "Here talketh the mocker of this boke his leva." Now, if you remember, boke is book, and leva would be leave. Translated, that means, here the maker of this book takes his leave. I think we talked about the maker. That's a marvelous word, a poet. And so Chaucer wrote the ending even before he finished the poem. That is, he went back and filled in stuff that that he hadn't done, and then he died. But this is the formal ending, and it's written in prose. And he says, shall I just read this in modern English? I'm not trying.
It might be better. We probably only have a few minutes left.
Now I pray to them all that hearken to this little treatise, or reckon it, that if there be anything in it that liketh them, that is, that they like, that thereof they thanken our